Good day. My name is Roberta Clarke, and I am a member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the rapporteur on the rights of LGBTI persons. I would like to thank the Human Rights Commission of Jalisco for their invitation to speak to you today. Through this rapporteurship on the rights of LGBTI persons, the Inter-American Commission prioritizes the promotion and protection of the rights of LGBTI persons to live free from discrimination and violence. The Commission is very aware that LGBTI persons continue to experience discrimination and exclusion. Direct and indirect discrimination is a reality, especially where there is no legislation and there are no policies that provide redress for discriminatory acts in the workplace or in access to services, or which recognizes the right of gender identity. We also deplore laws that continue to criminalize same-sex intimacy between consenting adults. These gaps in the legal framework of states across the Americas and the Caribbean contribute to the vulnerability of LGBTI persons to violence. We must recognize, given the prevalence of violence, and in particular against trans people, that this is a social phenomenon which has a specific intent and differentiated impacts. Many forms of violence are based on the desire of the perpetrator to punish those whose sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity do not conform to heterosexual normativity and binary gender expressions, gender roles, and gender stereotypes. This violence is an expression of intolerance, it's an expression of hate, and it is a rejection of the important human rights values of equal dignity for all people. In its 2015 report on violence against LGBTI persons, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights noted that the risk of trans persons, and especially trans women, to this prejudice-based discrimination is exacerbated by socioeconomic exclusion and by poverty. Trans women have fewer employment opportunities and may be engaged in sex work without adequate protection. This work exposes them to violence from clients, from organized criminal gangs, and sadly, too, also sometimes from police or members of security forces. Crimes against LGBTI persons stand out for their brutality and cruelty. The majority of trans victims of lethal violence, we also understand, are generally under 35 years old. In many cases, victims are killed after being subject to gruesome acts of inhumane or degrading treatment and multiple forms of extreme humiliation, debasement, torture, and this includes sexual violence. The Commission has expressed concern over what we consider to be inadequate police responses. Police and other state security agents across the Americas and the Caribbean often share the same attitudes and prejudices as the general population, and this feeds a culture of impunity and mistrust in the institutions of security, and generally, we think, undermines the rule of law. The Commission has reiterated that states have an obligation to apply due diligence in the investigation of human rights violations. Access to justice mechanisms are essential for the eradication of violence against LGBTI persons. And so I want to recognize the efforts made by the Human Rights Commission of the state of Jalisco in adopting a protocol for the treatment of victims of prejudice-based crimes. The adoption of special protocols that educate and sensitize public officials and service providers about the particular experiences and rights of LGBTI persons is an important development. This sensitization, this education should be available to all justice operators, including judges, prosecutors, and public defenders, and really anyone involved in the process of access to justice mechanisms. These trainings, these sensitizations should expand the understanding of concepts central to sexual orientation, gender identity, and bodily diversity, and make clear state obligations to end impunity for prejudice-based violence. LGBTI persons, like all of us, need to be able to report violence in environments where they feel safe, without the risk of victimization, without the risk of discrimination, mockery, victim blaming, or any other form of abuse. Trans persons' gender identity is important to be respected during the whole process. This is a challenge in those jurisdictions that do not recognize the right to gender identity, but this is not an impossible obstacle to overcome. In fact, it is an obstacle that we must overcome. States must ensure that there are effective reporting mechanisms to denounce violence and discrimination committed by state officials, that such claims are seriously investigated, and that sanctions are in place to ensure accountability. The Commission stresses the need for reliable statistical and disaggregated data about violence, but also about prosecutions and convictions that can better inform policies and legislation oriented towards securing LGBTI people's rights and access to justice. The adoption of protocols and the collection of data concerning the reporting of crimes against LGBTI persons is an example of human rights-based public policy. These are necessary steps towards the eradication of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, bodily diversity, and sex characteristics. And so in closing, I want to thank the Human Rights Commission again for its important work, for its leadership, and for the modeling of the kind of human rights-based policy that we need in the Americas and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.